Good morning, everyone. This is Tom Taylor here with Allison, Pictures and Stories, and we're glad to join with you this morning on our webinar where we will be talking about finding theme in order for your stories. It's interesting, Alice and I get to do this work together. Yesterday, we were interviewed about doing this work, and we get the opportunity to interview many people and talk with them about their stories. And someone was interviewing us, asking us about what it's like to do this as a business, and it just reminded us as to really what a wonderful thing this is that we get to do, and how much we enjoy listening to others and helping them put their stories and pictures and combine them into a really nice book. And how we'll talk this morning about finding theme in order for your stories. It's an important component of really making a nice finished piece that you can hand off and will be valuable to people both now and in the future. We've got on the title slide here a picture of Beverly Taylor Sorensen's book, Look Beyond the Weeds. And it's interesting, we'll talk a little bit more later about where titles come from, but they often come from a theme. And this theme of Look Beyond the Weeds was an experience that Beverly had with her husband, as this was before they had arrived at a significant point of wealth in their life, and she was out in her backyard weeding the garden, having 7 children, and things were not easy with 7 children in a new home, a busy family, and all the things she was involved with. And she was weeding the garden and just feeling kind of down as she looked close up to the task at hand. And her husband came out, and she was talking with him, saying, "Oh boy, I don't know, this is pretty tough." And he said to her, "Well, Beverly, look out at the city before you, and the sun in the sky, and this beautiful scenery. Look beyond the weeds." And that kind of became a theme for her, and became the title of her story. And so we'll talk about that later. But we'd like to begin, as we talk about theme, a little bit of a review, because that's where themes come from, and I'd like to have Allison do a bit of review that we've talked about and writing our stories and where themes come from.
Hi, just wanted to review just a little bit what we talked about last week for those of you who were or maybe were not able to join us, about the process of writing your stories and how to kind of get past the roadblocks of that. We've talked in previous webinars about determining your purpose, your audience, and the scope of your project, and having that firmly in your mind before you begin. We've talked about creating a timeline and using a timeline as a kind of a catch-all place to capture ideas for stories, to capture memories as they come up. And then looking over that timeline and choosing what really are the best and the most important stories of your life, taking some time to really choose what you want to say in your story, and then writing story note cards for each story idea that you have. Take a note card or a piece of paper and write down all the details that you can remember about that particular story, how you felt, what things looked like at the time, what the background of the story was. And then you should have a stack of story cards to work from there. And I think the actual writing, I put this kind of scared lady up on the slide because I think it can be, writing the stories itself can be the most intimidating part of the whole process for a lot of people. And even as much as I like to write, it's still, I still find myself avoiding just getting down and starting to write just because it's a little bit intimidating. So a few things that we talked about last week that will make it a little easier for you to begin writing your stories. And one of the most important that I will emphasize again today is to not start at the beginning, at the chronological beginning of your life when you're writing. And that's true even if you are going to do a chronological history. I'm not saying that putting your stories in chronological order is a bad thing, because it's a perfectly acceptable way of telling your history. But what I am saying is that you just don't want to start writing at the beginning of your life, because that can be really the hardest place to start. When you're writing about the circumstances of your birth, or even your ancestors, your family, your background, where you've come from, those are important things to add to your life history, if that's what you want to do. But it's a really difficult place to start writing. So what you want to do is you want to find that low-hanging fruit. You want to look over all the story ideas that you have and pick the one that you think will be the easiest story to tell. Either the one that's jumping off the page at you, saying, "Write me first. This is going to be fun." Because the easier you start yourself off, the more you'll be able to ease into that process, and then you can go and work with the more difficult stories later on, after you've gained some momentum and gained some confidence in doing that. It will make it much easier for you if you write your stories in a random order, and then you will put them together later. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is how do you find out what order to put your stories in? How do you connect all these little pearls of stories together that you have amassed once you've finished your writing, or at least finished the first draft of your stories. And also we talked a little bit about recording your stories. If you don't want to sit down and write everything out, or if writing is difficult for you or doesn't seem like that much fun, it's a really easy thing to just go get a recorder, and or you can use a voice recognition software like Dragon Dictation, and just talk into a recorder and tell your stories one at a time, as if you were telling them to someone sitting in the room there with you. And maybe you will actually have someone sitting in the room there with you. Sometimes that can make it easier for people, that they feel like they have an audience, and it's easier to tell a story if you have an audience. Other people may feel like it's easier if they don't have somebody with them and they're just talking, you're just talking to a microphone by yourself in a quiet room. That's less intimidating. So whichever way works for you, but that's definitely an option. And then you have an oral history, which you can then have transcribed, and you can do some editing on it, change it as much as you like, and then you have a narrative for your book that's come from your oral transcription. So that's a really good thing to consider for many people. We talked about the story note cards. This is where you just want to take your story idea, write down everything you can remember about the story, and you're not actually writing the story yet. You're just jotting down as many things as you can remember about that situation, what happened, how you felt at the time. And this is often where, once you start kind of digging up more details about this story idea, this is often where you can figure out what the point is, or what your theme is for this particular story that you're telling. Sometimes that's not always evident to you when you're writing things down on a timeline, but as you start to really think deeper about the story, often that's when you can really find out what the deeper meaning is of the story, if it has one, and sort of what the main point or the main theme of your story is. And it's an important thing to know, really what the reason is and why you want to tell this story, and why is the story important. So this is often when you discover the important overriding theme of this particular story, or the point of why you want to tell it to someone. So some questions to ask yourself as you are getting ready to write the story, as you're fleshing out your notes. Is the story humorous or entertaining? And sometimes your story doesn't need to have a big epic struggle in order to be an entertaining story. Although even very short and humorous stories can still have a struggle or a conflict of some sort, and that's part of what makes them funny. We used an example of Mark Twain last weekend, and Tom Sawyer, and that Tom Sawyer, simple, funny little story, but even he had a struggle in his story that he had to overcome, and that was that he didn't want to paint the fence, so he had to find someone else that could paint it for him. So, and that's partly what makes the story so entertaining. Does your story reveal the character? Does it reveal a character either of yourself or of someone else in your story? And especially for those in your family or people who appear in your story regularly, sometimes the stories can give clues to the reader as to what it was like to grow up with that person, or to what it was like for you to be in this environment. Does your story teach a lesson of some sort? Does it warn someone? Does it teach some kind of principle? And that doesn't mean that the story can't be still entertaining or humorous or heart-wrenching or anything if it's also teaching a lesson. I think some of the best stories have a moral of some sort to them. And it doesn't mean that you need to hit your reader over the head with the moral of the story. Usually that will be self-evident, and they can find that out themselves. But ask yourself, what did I learn from this situation? How did I change as a person? Where was my starting point in the story, and where did I end up at the end of the story? What was that trajectory of my life over this, the point of time of this particular story? So these are all great things to think about as you're fleshing out your story notes. And then as you sit down to write your story, one other thing that I emphasized last week, and it bears repeating, is that when you start writing your stories, and hopefully you have a stack of these story note cards or stacks of paper, whatever you've used to do that on, that you have a pile of them that you can then start. Just pick one, again, pick the easiest one to write, and just start writing or telling that story in your own words. Just get it all out on the paper. Don't worry at this point about trying to make it perfect. And if that's the next most important thing I will tell you to make your writing easier, and that is to just don't try to perfect that one story. Just write it, get it all down. Don't worry about whose feelings might be hurt by reading it, or don't worry about any of that stuff right now, because you'll take care of that in the editing. But just get the story down on paper. Don't worry about grammar, spelling, any of that kind of stuff. Just ignore those voices in your head that tell you that it might not be good enough, and just write it, leave it alone, and move on to the next story, because you'll have plenty of time later to go back over that story when it's fresh in your mind, to do some editing on that. So if you keep your momentum up by just moving on to the next story and the next, and not going back and obsessively editing and perfecting that first story, you will move a lot faster, and you'll feel like you've accomplished more. Trust me on this, it works much better to do it that way. And just remember that this first draft, you are the only one that's going to read this, and you have control. So don't worry so much at this point about what's contained in that draft that might be sensitive for others, or that might need revising, because you will have time to revise that. And that's something that we'll talk about in next week's webinar. So again, just to go over that process really quickly, you want to take your story notes, and you're just going to pick that low-hanging story. Pick the one that seems like it would be the most fun or the easiest to write, and just write that down, get it out on paper, and then set it aside, and then go back and pick the next easiest one to write, and write that one, and move on. And pretty soon you will have a stack of paper or files on your computer, however you choose to do this, and that will be your first rough draft of your story. But at this point, you don't have an order yet to put them in. So you're going to take that little stack of paper of these little stories that you have written, and then you're going to look at them as a whole and find out what order they should go in, and how you can make them into a cohesive whole.
So through this process of finding theme, and now we begin to talk about order, you may have many themes of your stories, and there's many aspects to your life. When we begin teaching people how to do this, and as we look at doing this ourselves, we go back to what is the purpose of why you're doing this. And you can, realize and have a theme there become apparent right to start with. When we began writing the book, where we helped Arthur and Lila Mae Debenham with their book Tender Mercies, they had a very clear idea of what they wanted the theme to be. and it was the tender mercies shown in their life. And this was then demonstrated by stories. But I think as we found that most of the people we work with, and even as we look at sometimes our own lives, that theme, or often those themes, are discovered after we begin this process, after we've written some of these stories that may each individually have a theme. As Allison said, as we're looking at writing each story, what's the point? What is this story about? And that's really what a theme is what is this story about? For Christmas this year, Allison gave me the book Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand. And just this morning, she said, you've got to read this book. And it's just one I've wanted to read, and it's really next on my list. But there's a theme I can see already in that book. And it's in the title and the things I've heard. And there's a compelling theme I can already guess is there. And you may already have or just have that in your life or understand what that is. But often we found that that's discovered as you've written your stories one at a time, and then you'll say, how do I put this all together? As you're looking on the screen, there's a picture of some pearls that are strung together, and each of those pearls is a story. And each of those pearls may have its own theme. But really the string that's holding those pearls together, that ties them in order, is often, that's the theme. What connects all of these? What is the element that brings all of these together and gives them order? Now, one of the things that we coach people to do is to gather a lot of your stories and look at this, and as much as you can start with understanding and knowing your purpose, that is great. But that can also change and be refined. And as I mentioned, often the themes of our lives, or certainly our particular book that we're working on at the time, is discovered through the process. We'll find, what is this about? What is my life about? We may have a really good idea, but like a title, that will come through the process, as Beverly Sorensen's did. Looking at this overall, she came back and said, well, that's, it's look beyond the weeds. That's kind of become a theme of her life, and she used that as a title of her book. I think of some of the other titles of books we've helped folks with, and didn't necessarily start with the title. Hank Hoole, his became Unfaltering Faith. And that really, say, yeah, that's the theme of his life. Fred Balls, as he looked back and put these wonderful stories together, each with a theme about education and work and new job and his family, all these wonderful themes. It came to the end as he looked at that, all those pieces together, and said, I think that really the theme, or the title in this case, was I'm not lucky, I'm blessed. So I'm kind of tying theme and title here together, but that's often the case where these things will come and they'll emerge, and you'll see more clearly as you put all of these stories out before you. And one of the ways that you'll find order, if you haven't got that already, certainly a good way to have order in your story is just chronological. You don't necessarily need to write your stories in a chronological fashion, but that's often a very good way to put those together and give order to your stories, is through a chronological nature. But that's not always the case, and it doesn't really have to be that way. But a great way is, once you've got these stories written, or at least you've got a lot of the stories identified and some notes made about each story, you'll say, how is this going to all come together? And a good way to do that is like when you're brainstorming, is to get a big picture view of your life, and in this case, of the stories that you've written about your life. Put them before you, and do it on a large table, maybe a dining room table, or clear a big spot of the floor and lay those down. And then you'll see, okay, here is the story about when I was in 4th grade, and then here's a story about when I was in college and was choosing my major, and here's a story about courtship, and here's a story about my children. And you'll lay those out and say, how am I going to find the best order for this? And again, a lot of that is going to come back to look at, say, is your purpose that may continually be refined, but you say, why am I doing this, and what do I want this to do? Who is this for? and there will start to become more clarity as to how you connect these pieces and what should come first, and how do you want to, take the reader and introduce these stories of your life. Is maybe they're a story that says, yeah, that kind of captures the way I feel about this, how I want to begin the story. And we've talked that you don't have to start writing at the beginning, and you don't necessarily have to introduce your first story at the beginning. And you may start with a flashback and then go chronological. But as you get these pieces all before you, in effect these pearls all laid before you, and you start to look at each one and say, how can I best tell my story? It will often emerge. And like I suggested, chronologically is a great way. Even many of these are put together simply as a string of thematic stories individually. The book that we had the opportunity to work with, the McNaughton family, that became a thematic book. The stories were put together introducing what the theme was about, how important the farm was and life on the farm. And then we simply took these pearls that were about the farm animals and the farm equipment and working and being around the dinner table and irrigating and all these many wonderful elements of the farm, and say, how do these fit together? How does one connect? And you'll start to see connections as to, oh yeah, well, here's how the story of these tractors would tie into putting up the hay, and how that would tie into how they dealt with the farm animals, and you'll begin to find an order. And there's not a set of rules that you necessarily do this, other than knowing that what you want to communicate to your reader, that these stories that you've got down here, how are you going to best serve them? How are you going to accomplish what you would like to do with your stories for your reader or readers? What is the best way to begin and to connect these, and what is that string? Is there a theme, whether to your life or a theme to this particular compilation of stories that you've put together? And as we suggested, your stories certainly don't have to be a comprehensive view of your life, and this theme, or as you put these together, it doesn't have to be that this is the theme of your life, but there may be an emerging theme for this grouping of stories as to how you'll put those together. And so that's what we encourage you to do, is take a big picture look at all the stories that you have before you and say, what's this all about? What am I about here, and how can I best share that with my audience? And that really becomes the theme that will string these together and give order. I think at this point we'd like to get some of your feedback and open this to questions. I know I can look back as I talk about titles, as we look at what shall I call this? And again, that we suggest that most often that comes to the later stage, after you've been able to look at all these together. And if you have not already decided what theme it is, that will come. Themes come from where the passion is, where the things that really you care about, and what gives energy to your writing and to your stories. And then you'll find how they connect and how they find order by what you really want to communicate. And as an autobiography, the thing is we have so many elements of our lives that we can communicate. Memoir often takes where we focus that in a little bit more, largely around a theme. And so that's what we encourage you to do, is take these stories that you've got together, and if there is a theme, that's great. Patchwork is just fine, where they are not necessarily connected, but you still say, I'm going to put this one, and then this one will come after that, and it doesn't necessarily have to be like shuffling the deck, because you will find a theme as to how you want to do this. But
one thing that, just jump in here for a second, one device that we employ quite frequently and is can be a good way to proceed is to use flashbacks to start your story, rather than just starting with a chronological beginning. Even if you're telling a basic chronological narrative, you can still start with a dramatic incident that will draw your reader into the story really quickly. So especially if once you find your overall theme of the book, often you can find a dramatic incident or something in your life that's happened, or one of your stories that is portrays that theme in some way, and you can actually start with that and tell that story first, and then you can back up after that, and then back up and go back to your childhood and start in that order, or you can go to a completely different place in the story. But often that's a really effective way to get the reader engaged in the story right off the top of the bat, rather than starting with your birth or with the beginning of the scope of time that you're working with. And we've done this with quite a few of our clients. Tom mentioned the Debenhams book earlier, and they had quite a dramatic story of how they met and how they eventually got married. And so we started with that story of how they first met each other. And then we flashed back to each of their childhoods in turn, and then brought them back together to that point of time where we then continued on with the story of their family as a married couple. And so that can often work really well for, to kind of start with something that's a little more unusual that way.
And just back to finding the order and really understanding if there are any overarching themes, is to put all of the stories that you've gathered and put them before you and look at them and talk out loud, and you'll find that there is a discovery process to find what theme is, and it can be a very satisfying moment for you to look and say, yeah, that is a theme of my life. That's something that's important that I want to share, and it can really help focus you and focus your stories as you continue to put those together and refine them as you move on into the editing process, which know that it's a continual process to say, how can I tell these stories and share these things that I really care about with these people that I really, really care about, to help serve them well and make this something that's easy and satisfying for them to understand and learn from you.
One other thing that you want to be aware of too is that to make sure that once you found an order for your stories and you put them loosely in the order that you think they should be in, is to read all of your stories through in that order. And even reading them aloud can really help with this too sometimes. And see, is there anything that's really jarring? Does it jump, when I jump from one story to the next, do I need to write some sort of little transitory passage in there that will lessen that jump for the reader? And it could be just even, you may have to provide a little bit of details to set the scene at the beginning of the next story to let the reader know that you've made a jump in time. You need to sort of give your readers little clues along the way so that they can follow you and know where you are in your life, especially if you're doing a non-chronological narrative or a partially chronological narrative. And it may be something that if you tell a story of your childhood and then you jump to, maybe it's about a situation with your father. You sort of have this theme in the portion of your story where you're talking about your relationship with your father. So you may tell a story about your childhood that has to do with that dynamic between you and your father, and then you may jump to another story about something that happened between the two of you in your teenage years. And you just want to make sure that as you move on to the next story, that you give the reader some sort of clue to let them know that you're now in your teenage years. Whether, you could just say, it was the year 1963, or you could give some other kind of more expository detail to say that, I was on my way to the senior prom, and start the story that way, so that you offer your reader a clue so they can follow along.
I think another thing on those bridges and transitions that you'll find some of the really great novelists use, you can use some of this yourself, is to give them reason to turn the page and to get to the next story. And so as you make that transition, how do they connect, or how do you want them to go on to the next page? And you'll find and discover those as maybe apparent in your own stories. But we'll talk and answer any questions that you may have, and certainly next time we're going to talk about editing and refining, and certainly any good writing is about rewriting and polishing. And that's even with pearls, what you do to make them beautiful is to polish them, and that's where we get into editing. But now we'd like to open it to questions and address some of the issues that you may have. I know we had a question from Joan.
Yeah, and I'll address that in just a minute. If you have any questions about this idea of theme, or putting your stories in order, please go ahead and type them in so we can see them. We've muted all of your microphones because we've been having audio issues when we turn your mics on. So if you could type that question, or even let us know that you want to ask a question verbally, and we can unmute your particular mic. But while we're waiting to see if any of those questions come in, just one more thing that I thought I would mention about this idea of an overarching theme for your book, and hopefully this is something that you've already thought about way back when you were doing your purpose statement. But also I think sometimes the theme, your overall theme, can emerge as you are writing these stories, and it may be different from what you originally set out that you wanted your stories to be. And once you find that theme that really speaks to you, you may at this point decide that some of the stories that you have don't quite fit in that theme, and then you can decide at this point, do I want to put these stories aside and use them for a different project, or do I want to to include them? So it may even narrow your scope even more once you found that theme. I was working on some story ideas for my own life, and ended up finding several that I was going to work on do something that was sort of more in a specific time period, but I kept running into these, I kept finding these sort of same situations where I had been either spiritually or actually rescued in some way. And so I started noticing that, wow, there's this commonality in these certain things that have happened to me where I've literally been pulled out of bad situations by either a friend or by God, or by some other situation, and noticed, I started recognizing this pattern in my life, which was quite an interesting thing. And so I decided that I would take a few of these stories and put them together with the theme of, and the title that I chose for that, and I'm still working on this project, but the title that I chose for that was Evidence of Things Not Seen. And so I noticed that this was a strong theme in my own life, that these sorts of things kept happening to me, and so I wanted to write something about with that as a theme. So okay, we will open. Got a couple of questions here. Let's see. So Joan is asking, are you saying that the rough draft is your story cards? Essentially, the rough draft is once you have written your stories from your story cards. So you start with your stack of story cards, and then you're going to actually write and flesh out those stories and do your actual writing. So once you have all of your story cards written into a pile of stories, then, or on your computer in random order in a file, and then you have found a rough order to put those stories in, then essentially you have the first draft of your book right there. You've got your stories written and you have them in a rough order. Then you can start to read through your book as a whole, read through your narrative as a whole, and decide what needs to be cut, what needs to be improved, what needs to be toned down. So that's where you have your rough draft, is after you've actually done the writing from your story cards. And in fact, I even have a slide for that. So, and just know too that once everybody, even professional writers, they write a not very good first draft, and that is just part of the process. So don't beat yourself up if you read it through the first time and go, oh, that's just really rough. There's a lot of work to do on that, because that's part of the process. So just know that you're going to have an opportunity to polish that up and make it better. Tina is asking, the author of Unbroken is Laura Hillebrand, Hillebrand, I think. And just one of my favorite biographies that I've ever read. I highly recommend that book. It's just incredibly inspiring. She was also the author of Seabiscuit, if anybody read that book. Okay, Tom says, there is a class on memoir writing rotating throughout the valley. The first one is tonight at 300 North, 1300 West in Salt Lake City. Great. If anybody wants to go take that. Tom, do you know if is there a charge for that, or is that like who's producing that class? Anyway, I'll just put that question out there, and if he can maybe answer that for us, because I think that would be quite helpful for everybody. While we're waiting to hear back from Tom, I wanted to address another question that Joan had, which is a little bit off topic of what we're talking about today, but she's been doing some scanning and had a question about scanning and whether you should use the photo editing software in the scanner or the scanner driver settings to improve your photos before you do touch-ups later in Photoshop or some other photo editing software. And so I'll just address that for a minute. I think it depends upon how good your scanner is and how good your scanner driver software is, really, as to whether you want to do some editing directly in the scanner. Most scanners have some settings for, auto correct settings or auto tone that will correct color shifts or correct levels, contrast levels in the actual scanner software that will improve the look of your scans. As someone who uses Photoshop in a professional way, I personally don't use the scanner software to do any editing first, because I know how to manipulate them properly in Photoshop, and it gives me more control if I just have the raw scan, and then I can get it exactly the way I want it in Photoshop. However, that being said, I think if you have decent scanner software, for many of you, I think sometimes using some of those auto controls can help you come up with a better scan, especially if you're not that savvy with Photoshop or with other photo editing software. And let's see, Joan had yeah, she said she heard at a Roots Tech scanning class just to do the tone editing first, and I think that can be a good idea. And either the tone or what's called levels in Photoshop, or might be called contrast in your photo software, because a lot of times scans can come out looking a little bit dull, a little bit low contrast. There's not a big difference between your highlights of your really light areas and your shadow areas that are really dark, and everything is kind of a little bit more grayed out, and often your raw scan without any correction will look a little flat that way. And so, this is something that you can change in Photoshop, or you can lighten the lights a little bit and darken the darks in it. That will make your photo look punchier and just look a lot better when it's printed. But there is, most scanning software will have little settings that you can put in there that will increase or decrease the contrast of that and make it look better. And I think that if you at least do that much first, then you can continue to tweak it later in Photoshop if you want to. So that's what I would probably recommend for most people. That, like I said, I like to have just the raw file, because sometimes the scanner driver settings can go a little bit too far, and then you can't really go backwards unless you rescan the photo to bring some of that back. So the only thing I can do is just tell you to kind of test it out. Do a few scans with the settings on, and then do a few without, and try to do it yourself in Photoshop and see what the results look like and which you prefer. And because depending upon your scanner driver and how good it is, you'll get different results. So, okay, Tom says that the memoir writing class that he mentioned earlier is free, and he says I'll have to access my email to find the schedule of the presentations. So 300 North, 1300 West, Salt Lake, first one starts tonight. So if anybody's interested in that, you can check that out. Any other questions or issues that anybody is having at the moment in working on their personal or family histories? We'll just open it up to any topic at this point if you have any issues you're dealing with. Tom, anything else you want to? Okay, Joan says, Photoshop scanner technician was saying that editing through the scanner makes the file structure for the original you were making is better than doing the editing after the scan. Again, I would agree that it can, but it depends upon the quality of your scanner driver, and some are better than others, and so it really depends. So I would just say just experiment with your scanner and see which way gives you the better results. But if you do the editing in the scanner driver at first and it turns out well and you like the way it looks, then it's definitely going to be easier for you to do that than to have to edit each one individually in Photoshop afterwards.
Yeah, well said. I agree with that. Is experiment and find what works for you, and that's really some of the same thing to do in finding order to your stories. Is experiment, test some, and see how that feels. Read it out loud. Maybe share it with a trusted friend or family member and get some feedback. But make it a test. See how it feels, and then let it set for a few days, or and come back to it and say, how does this work? Is this doing what I want it to do?
I'll just mention there's a question from Karen, who is joining us, it looks like for the first time today, and asking if we can or we can catch up on the ones that they missed. We have recorded the previous webinars. They are residing right now on the How to Save Your Life membership website. So if you have purchased the How to Save Your Life kit and are working with the kit, you'll be able to find those real easily on the membership website. For a limited time, we will also be happy to give you, if you don't have the kit, we would be happy to give you a link that you can go. They are unlisted on YouTube, so you won't be able to just go to YouTube and find them on your own, but we'd be happy to send you a link. So what I'll do right now is I will put I'll put my email address in the chat window, and then you can email me, and I'd be happy to send you the link to look at the previous webinars as well as this one.
And I'm going to just say while she's typing that in, as you look at this picture on the screen of, just so you know, professional writers write crummy first drafts too. Yeah, get to that point of getting a crummy first draft. That's how they all start out. I mean, no one writes to have it be perfect right to start with. And I say no one, maybe there are some, I don't know, but most professionals get to the crummy first draft, and they often call that other things that we don't generally even repeat as the name of those first drafts. But that's a major victory, and when you get to that point of, then you can change it. And like a picture, you want to work with these things and improve them and make them better and say, how do they fit? How can I best communicate these things that I really care about?
Okay, I posted my email address, allison@picturesandstories.com, and you can email me, and I'd be happy to give you the links for the webinar. If you know other people that might be interested in this, you're welcome to pass that information along. And if you have not already signed up for our email newsletter, if you go to the picturesandstories.com website, we would love for you to sign up for our newsletter. A lot of these issues that we talk about, we post regularly on our blog, and we promise not to spam you with a bunch of sales material, and we don't give out your email to anybody else, but it's a terrific resource as you're working on these projects. So if you haven't already, if you're not already on our newsletter list, please go to picturesandstories.com and click on the sign up for our newsletter link. Tina says, do you have any suggestions on an app to use on iPad for writing your stories? Yes. I just got an iPad for Christmas. Thank you, Tom. And I was getting a little frustrated with it on trying to use that to a little, he says a little. I was getting quite frustrated with it actually in trying to use it for writing. I did purchase a keyboard cover that has a nice keyboard that goes with the iPad, which helps a lot because I don't like typing on a flat screen. But I found that Google Docs just like saved my life and kept me from chucking the iPad out the window, because what you can do is you just, it's free, you sign up for Google Docs and you can actually type your stories in Google Docs and it resides in the cloud. So I can go back and forth between my iPad and between my computer depending upon whether I'm at home writing or whether I need to be somewhere else and writing or taking notes. And so, it's immediate that I don't have to copy things back and forth. I can even Tom and I can even work on the same document at the same time from two different computers. So I really enjoy using Google Docs for that. It doesn't have a lot of great formatting tools and that kind of stuff, but you're not going to be worrying about that when you're writing your story anyway, because that the formatting. You're not even going to worry about it until you start putting your book together later. So I would highly recommend just using Google Docs to type in, and then you can work on it. I can even type it on my phone if I wanted to, because they're all linked into that Google Docs, my Google Drive as they call it. So that's a great thing to use. Karen says, can we get all the links for the kit and other for your blog, etc.? Yeah, I will type in the website addresses, and you can go to the How to Save Your Life kit. You can get to that from the picturesandstories.com website, which I'll type in right now. If I can type and talk at the same time, which is highly unlikely. You can also go to howtosaveyourlifeinabook.com, and that will give you more information about how to save your life one chapter at a time, the book and the kit, and how to purchase that. If you are interested in a discount code, if you want to purchase the kit and you want to get it at a discounted rate, we're offering just for a limited time, you can get the kit for $99, which is the retail price is $249. So if you're interested in purchasing that, you can send me an email and I will send you a discount code for that. Diana, will you be giving us some pointers regarding actually typing the stories into a word processor and adding photos? That is what we will talk about in a few more weeks in the putting it all together. One thing I'll say right now is that we do not recommend trying to use word processing software like Word or WordPerfect or any OpenOffice, anything like that, for adding photos to your stories. That should be done in an actual design program, because otherwise you're just going to cause yourself an unbelievable amount of frustration. And I'm sure some of you have attempted to do that and know firsthand how frustrating that is to try to add photos to a Word document. So yes, we will be talking about that in detail, but it'll be in a few more weeks. Okay, Venus says, please write what you said. Google what? Google Docs. And if you have a Google email account, then you've already got that set up, and you can just install the little Google Drive software. It gives you all the instructions on there. If you don't have a Google account, if you don't have a Gmail account already, it's pretty easy to set one up. Any other questions? Or?
I'm just going to add one little point here about finding finding theme and order for your stories. As we've mentioned, one of the themes that we've had of hopefully making this easier, getting started, is to do this one chapter at a time. And so you may not necessarily have the overarching theme of your life, but you may say, this particular chapter that I'm working on right now might be about education, or it might be about work, or it might be about faith, or whatever you decide that particular chapter may be about, and that theme where you're gathering stories or elements of your life regarding that theme. So it can be a great way for you to take those elements of your life and just make that the theme for your particular chapter, and give focus to what you're doing to just get something done, to get one piece. Like I say, may not necessarily be the overarching or most important piece, but you get one done, and the things that you will learn from that will be very valuable to you.
Okay, we've got a few more minutes. If anybody else has anything they want to add, I just posted the website that has the information about our kit, which is howtosaveyourlifeinabook.com. But you can also find information on that on picturesandstories.com. And on our main website, Pictures and Stories, that has pricing and other information for our custom work that we do with our clients as well. So if you're looking for some help with custom putting a book together, if you've written your story and you just need some help with it, with putting it together, the pictures, we'd be happy to help you with that. So that's always an option as well. And let's see, let me just mention next week we are going to be talking about editing your story. So once you have your first draft done and you have a rough order for your stories, then what do you do? So we will talk about that in depth next week. Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, have a wonderful week, and do something, even if it's something small today. Maybe it's go to that seminar on memoir writing that Tom Coppin has suggested, but to do something and move ahead on this great project of your life.
All right, thanks for joining us today, and we hope to see you next week.